He never changed his pillowcase. 79 days later, his face was unrecognizable. A 26-year-old man arrives at the emergency room, unable to open his left eye. The entire left side of his face is swollen. His cheek appears distorted. His eyelid is stretched shut. And when doctors press gently against the skin beneath his eye, something unexpected happens. A thick yellow fluid begins draining from a small opening beside his nose. Within minutes, he is rushed for emergency imaging. The concern is no longer cosmetic. The concern is no longer an infection of the skin. Doctors are now worried about something much worse. Because if the infection has reached the structures behind the eye, he could permanently lose his vision. And if it's beyond that, he may not survive. This is inspired by real medical concepts. This is what happened to Brian. This is hidden pathogens. Brian was 26 years old. He worked remotely. Most of his days were spent in the same apartment, the same desk, the same chair, the same bedroom, the same bed. He wasn't what most people would consider unhealthy. He exercised occasionally, rarely got sick, didn't smoke, didn't drink much. And because he spent so much time at home, he developed habits, small habits, the kind people never think about. One of those habits involved his pillow. Every night he slept on the same pillowcase, week after week, month after month. He always intended to change it, but he kept forgetting or telling himself he'd do it tomorrow. Then tomorrow became next week, and next week became next month. At first, nothing happened, or at least nothing obvious. But then day one arrived, and with it came a single red bump, just above his left nostril. It looked like a pimple, small, annoying, completely harmless. Or so he thought. Brian stared at it in the bathroom mirror. Most people have done this before. A small blemish appears. You examine it, touch it, press it, wonder whether to leave it alone. Brian chose not to. He squeezed it, nothing came out. The area became irritated, red tender, but otherwise unchanged. By the next morning, the bump seemed slightly larger. Still nothing alarming. Just a stubborn pimple, so he ignored it. The problem was that Brian wasn't seeing what was happening beneath the skin, because what looked like a simple blemish was becoming something else entirely. A week later, the redness hadn't disappeared. It had spread. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The skin felt warmer, more sensitive, and every morning he woke up with a strange soreness on the left side of his face. He blamed stress. Long work hours, lack of sleep, anything except the real problem. His friends barely noticed. His co-workers certainly didn't, but Brian did. Because every day the mirror showed something slightly different. Something slightly worse. And then came day 14, the day the pain began. Pain changes everything. Pain forces attention. The area around the bump now throbbed constantly, especially at night, especially when he rested his face against the pillow. But instead of seeking help, Brian made another decision. He searched online. Within minutes, he convinced himself it was acne, a clogged pore, nothing serious. He purchased over-the-counter treatments, scrubs, creams, spot treatments. And for several days, he attacked the area repeatedly. The skin became irritated, inflamed, damaged. The redness deepened, and underneath the surface, bacteria were finding exactly what they needed. Warmth, moisture, and damaged tissue, the perfect environment to grow. 3 weeks after the first bump appeared, Brian woke up and immediately knew something was wrong. The left side of his face felt heavy. Not swollen, heavy, like there was pressure beneath the skin. He walked to the bathroom, turned on the light, and froze. The area beside his nose had noticeably enlarged. The skin looked stretched, shiny, tender. When he touched it, a sharp pain shot through his cheek. That was the first moment he considered seeing a doctor. But then something happened. The swelling seemed to improve later that day. Or at least he thought it did. And that false improvement convinced him he didn't need help. Not yet. Unfortunately, the infection was not improving. It was expanding, quietly, deeper, beyond what he could see. 5 weeks after the first bump, Brian's girlfriend noticed something. His smile looked uneven, subtle, almost impossible to detect. But once she pointed it out, he couldn't unsee it. The left side of his face appeared slightly different from the right. Not enough to alarm anyone. Not enough to send him to a hospital, but enough to create a question. What exactly was happening beneath his skin? At this point, doctors would later suspect that a pocket of infection had already begun forming beneath the surface. A collection of bacteria, dead cells, inflammatory fluid, and tissue debris. A structure known as an abscess. And abscesses have a dangerous characteristic. They often create the illusion that a problem is localized, contained, simple, when in reality, pressure is building underneath, waiting, expanding, searching for a path of least resistance. And Brian had no idea how large it was becoming. Day 42. 6 weeks after the first bump appeared, Brian stopped taking photos of himself. At first, this wasn't intentional. He simply noticed that every picture seemed wrong. The left side of his face looked fuller than the right. His jawline appeared uneven. His cheek looked slightly raised. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make strangers stare, but enough that he noticed, enough that his confidence began to disappear. And every morning, the mirror greeted him with a version of himself that looked slightly less familiar. The strange thing was that some days felt better. The swelling would decrease. The redness would fade. The pain would become manageable. Then, without warning, everything would return, worse than before. This pattern convinced Brian that recovery was happening. In reality, it was one of the reasons the problem survived so long. Because every temporary improvement delayed the decision that could have stopped everything. Day 49, 7 weeks after the first bump, Brian developed headaches. At first, they felt ordinary. A dull pressure behind the eyes, the kind people blame on screens, stress, sleep deprivation. But these headaches were different. They always appeared on the left side, always behind the same eye, and every day they lasted longer. What Brian didn't realize was that the infection was no longer confined to the superficial layers of skin. It was beginning to involve deeper facial tissues. The face is filled with small compartments, spaces, passageways, structures that allow blood vessels, nerves, and muscles to travel from one area to another. An infection doesn't need to destroy everything in its path. Sometimes it simply follows existing routes. And once it begins moving through those routes, the situation changes dramatically. A skin problem can become a facial problem. A facial problem can become an eye problem. And an eye problem can become something even worse. Day 56. By the 8th week, Brian's pillowcase had become an afterthought. The original bump was no longer the issue. The swelling had become the issue. The pain had become the issue. The headaches had become the issue. His girlfriend begged him to see a doctor. His co-workers began asking if he was feeling okay. One afternoon during a video call, someone asked if he'd been injured. He laughed it off, claimed he'd slept wrong. But later that night, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror and examined himself. For the first time, fear appeared, not concern, not annoyance, fear. Because the face looking back at him no longer looked entirely like his own. The skin beneath his eye was raised, his cheek seemed distorted, his smile no longer matched itself, and the redness had expanded. The infection was winning. Day 61. And then came the fever. A low fever at first, nothing dramatic. 99 degrees, 100 degrees, slight chills, mild fatigue. Again, easy to dismiss, but fever is often the body's way of announcing that a battle is occurring. The immune system had recognized an enemy, and it was responding aggressively. Millions of immune cells flooded the affected tissues. Inflammation increased, fluid accumulated, pressure rose. Unfortunately, this response can become a double-edged sword. The body's attempt to destroy an infection can also increase swelling, increase pain, increase tissue damage. And in Brian's case, that swelling was occurring dangerously close to one of the most important structures in the body, his eye. 67 days after the first bump appeared, Brian woke up unable to fully open his left eye. At first, he thought he was imagining it. He splashed water on his face, blinking repeatedly, trying to clear his vision, but the problem remained. The eyelid felt heavy, thick, as though something beneath it was pushing outward. When he finally managed to open the eye, he noticed something else. His vision seemed slightly blurry, only slightly, barely enough to notice, but enough to create panic. That was the moment he finally scheduled an appointment. Unfortunately, the appointment wasn't for another week, and Brian decided he could wait. The infection had other plans. Day 72, the pain became unbearable, not constant, worse. Intermittent, sharp, explosive, sudden jolts that seemed to originate deep inside his face, sometimes near the nose, sometimes beneath the eye, sometimes behind it. Each episode lasted only seconds, but every episode left him shaken. Sleeping became difficult. Eating became difficult, even smiling hurt. The pressure inside the tissues continued building. The abscess continued growing, and now the structures surrounding his eye were becoming involved. At this point, doctors would later estimate that the infection had been progressing for more than 2 months, and the consequences were beginning to accelerate. Before everything changed, Brian noticed drainage, a small amount, yellow, thick, appearing near the original bump. For a brief moment, he felt relieved. Maybe it was healing. Maybe the pressure was finally releasing. Maybe the problem was ending. But what he interpreted as improvement was actually evidence of something else. The abscess had become so large that it was creating pathways through surrounding tissues, searching for a place to release its contents. The body was no longer containing the infection. The infection was creating its own exits, and beneath the surface, more damage was occurring. 79 days after the first bump appeared, Brian woke up screaming. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced before. His face felt as though it were being crushed from the inside. He stumbled toward the bathroom, turned on the light, and immediately dropped his phone. The person staring back at him looked unfamiliar. The left side of his face had swollen dramatically overnight. His eye was nearly shut. His cheek appeared distorted. The skin looked stretched and inflamed. His nose seemed pulled slightly to one side. For several seconds, he simply stared, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he noticed something else, his vision. The left eye wasn't just blurry anymore. It was becoming difficult to focus. That was the moment panic finally replaced denial. Within an hour, he was in the emergency room. And within another hour, doctors were looking at scans that made the situation far more serious than anyone had expected. Because the infection wasn't merely beneath the skin. It wasn't merely inside an abscess. It had spread into deeper facial spaces. And it was moving towards the structures surrounding the eye. The question was no longer, what caused this? The question had become, can we stop it before permanent damage occurs? And for Brian, the answer was far from certain. Doctors gathered around the imaging results. The swelling everyone could see was only part of the story. What concerned them more was what couldn't be seen from the outside. Hidden pockets of infection, inflamed tissue, areas of pressure building behind the visible swelling. One physician pointed toward the region surrounding the eye. Another reviewed blood work. A third examined the drainage near Brian's nose, and together they arrived at the same conclusion. The situation had progressed beyond a routine infection. This had become an emergency. Because once infections enter deeper facial spaces, the risks increase dramatically. Vision loss, spread into surrounding structures, severe systemic infection, potential complications that could change a person's life permanently. Brian had spent 79 days ignoring a growing problem. Now doctors had only hours to prevent it from becoming much worse. Before we continue, and before doctors discover what actually caused Brian's face to become unrecognizable, I have a quick question. If you've made it this far into the video, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. Most people click away after the first few minutes. You stayed. So, if you're watching right now and you're not subscribed, I'd genuinely like to know why. Not as a joke, not as a trick. Because every one of these stories takes hours of research, writing, editing, and fact-checking to put together. And the people who stay until this point are the reason these videos exist in the first place. So if you enjoy medical mysteries, true stories, and the kind of cases that make you think differently about everyday habits, subscribe. And if you decide not to subscribe, that's completely your choice. But leave a comment and tell me why. I'm genuinely curious. Now let's get back to Brian, because what doctors discovered next was far worse than anyone expected. And trust me, you'll want to stay for the diagnosis, because the thing doctors found hiding beneath Brian's skin wasn't what anyone expected. The emergency department moved quickly. Blood samples were taken. Intravenous lines were placed. Broad-spectrum antibiotics were started before doctors even knew exactly which bacteria they were dealing with. Time mattered, because infections don't wait for laboratory results, they spread. And the deeper they spread, the harder they become to stop. Brian sat in a hospital bed with an ice pack pressed against the side of his face. His girlfriend remained beside him. For the first time in nearly 3 months, someone else was making decisions. Because Brian was exhausted, the fever had intensified, his head pounded. His vision seemed to fluctuate, and every movement of his face triggered another wave of pain. A physician entered the room. He reviewed the scans, reviewed the blood work, then began asking questions that initially seemed unrelated. Any recent injuries? No. Any dental problems? No. Any recent surgeries? No. Any travel? No. Any contact with contaminated water? No, the doctor continued. What skincare products do you use? Brian listed them. Nothing unusual. Then came a question that almost seemed ridiculous. Tell me about your pillow. Brian blinked. My pillow? The physician nodded. How often do you change the pillowcase? The room became quiet. Brian looked toward his girlfriend. She already knew the answer. Honestly, the doctor waited. I can't remember, the physician continued. Try, Brian thought. A week, a month, no longer. Much longer. Then realization appeared on his face. The same realization his girlfriend had already reached. It had been almost 3 months. 79 days, the physician nodded slowly. Not because the pillowcase alone explained everything, but because it might explain how the chain reaction began. Now here's where many people misunderstand what happened. The pillowcase itself wasn't some magical object. It wasn't cursed. It wasn't uniquely dangerous. The danger came from what accumulated over time. Every night while we sleep, our bodies leave behind traces of themselves: skin cells, natural oils, sweat, environmental particles, microorganisms that normally live harmlessly on the skin. Most of the time, these things aren't a problem. Your skin is remarkably good at protecting you. But protection depends on one thing: the barrier remaining intact. Remember Brian's first mistake? The bump beside his nose, the repeated squeezing, the scratching, the constant touching. The harsh treatments, each one created tiny injuries, tiny openings, tiny opportunities. And bacteria don't need large opportunities. Sometimes they only need one. The physicians suspected that what started as a small skin problem had evolved into a deeper bacterial infection, then into an abscess, then into something much more dangerous. But there was still a question. Why had it become so severe? Why hadn't his body stopped it sooner? The answer was hiding inside the scans. The abscess wasn't the main problem anymore. The abscess was merely evidence of the main problem, because the infection had begun traveling through deeper facial tissues. To understand why this mattered, imagine the face as a city. Roads connect neighborhoods. Highways connect districts. Everything is linked together. The structures inside the face work similarly. Blood vessels, nerves, muscles, connective tissues. Multiple pathways exist between regions. An infection that gains access to those pathways can spread beyond where it started. And Brian's infection had already begun doing exactly that. The swelling beneath his eye wasn't random. The pain behind the eye wasn't random. The visual changes weren't random. They were clues. Signs that nearby structures were becoming involved. Doctors now feared something called orbital involvement. meaning the infection was approaching tissues surrounding the eye itself. And if that happened, the consequences could become permanent. A specialist was called, then another. The emergency department became increasingly busy around Brian's bed. One physician checked his vision repeatedly. Another evaluated eye movement. A third reviewed the imaging scans. Nobody was panicking, but everyone was moving quickly, which is often far more concerning. Experienced doctors don't always show urgency through emotion. They show it through speed. And the speed at which Brian's team was working told the story. The infection needed to be controlled immediately, because if bacteria gained access to critical structures behind the eye, complications could accelerate rapidly. Vision problems, severe tissue damage, systemic infection, potential spread through the bloodstream. Each hour mattered, each decision mattered, and every delay over the previous 79 days had brought him closer to this moment. The first major goal was simple: relieve the pressure, drain the infection, reduce the bacterial burden. But simple doesn't mean easy. The abscess sat within tissues that were already inflamed, already swollen, already painful. Under local anesthesia, doctors began the procedure. Brian remained awake. The pressure he felt over the previous weeks had become almost unbearable. And then something remarkable happened. As the abscess was opened and drained, the pressure immediately began decreasing, not completely, not instantly, but enough for Brian to notice. Enough for him to realize how much hidden tension had been building beneath the skin. Fluid that had accumulated over weeks was finally removed. Samples were collected, sent to the laboratory. The exact bacterial species would soon be identified. But treatment couldn't wait for confirmation. The antibiotics continued. The monitoring continued. And now came the hardest part: waiting. That night felt longer than the previous 79 days combined. The swelling remained significant. The fever fluctuated. The uncertainty remained. Doctors checked his vision repeatedly. His girlfriend barely slept. Every few hours, another physician entered the room. Another examination, another assessment, another update. And each update carried the same message. The next 24 hours would be critical, because treatment had begun. But success wasn't guaranteed, not yet. The infection had spent nearly 3 months establishing itself. The body wouldn't reverse all of that damage overnight. Recovery would take time. And first, they needed to know whether the antibiotics were winning, or whether the infection still had one more surprise waiting. The following day, the laboratory provided answers. The cultures later confirmed what doctors suspected. Brian was suffering from a severe staphylococcal facial abscess with developing cellulitis around the tissues near the eye. In simple terms, common skin bacteria had entered through damaged skin near the original blemish. Once beneath the surface, the infection spread deeper into the soft tissues of the face. And because the infection was dangerously close to the orbit, the structures surrounding the eye, doctors feared it could progress into orbital cellulitis, a potentially vision-threatening emergency. The danger was that ordinary bacteria were given extraordinary opportunities: damaged skin, repeated irritation, delayed treatment, weeks of progression. Those factors transformed a manageable problem into a medical emergency. And now, finally, doctors knew exactly what they were fighting. The question was whether they had caught it in time. For the first time in weeks, Brian woke up without feeling worse. That may not sound like a victory, but in medicine, sometimes the first sign of recovery isn't improvement, it's stabilization. The fever that had haunted him for days no longer climbed higher. The headaches became less intense. The pressure behind his eye seemed slightly reduced. Doctors remained cautious. One good morning doesn't erase 79 days of damage. But it was enough to create something Brian hadn't felt in a long time: hope. His girlfriend noticed it too. The fear that had dominated the previous days began to fade. Not disappear, just fade. Because there was still a major question hanging over everyone involved. How much damage had already been done? On the third day in the hospital, Brian finally asked for a mirror. At first, nobody wanted to give him one. The swelling remained significant. The discoloration remained obvious. The drainage site was still healing. But eventually, one of the nurses handed him a small mirror. Brian stared at his reflection, and for several seconds he said nothing. The title of this story isn't an exaggeration. The person staring back at him barely resembled the version of himself from 3 months earlier. One eye remained partially swollen. His cheek looked distorted. Parts of his face appeared asymmetrical. His skin looked exhausted, inflamed, older somehow. Not because 79 days had aged him, but because 79 days of infection had changed him. The realization hit harder than any physical pain. This wasn't just an infection. This wasn't just a medical problem. It had become part of his identity. For weeks, every conversation, every photograph, every mirror, every interaction had been shaped by what was happening to his face, and now he had to confront it directly. Fortunately, the specialists had encouraging news. The structures of the eye itself appeared intact. The infection had approached dangerous territory, but it had not caused permanent blindness, at least not in Brian's case. The visual blurring that terrified him was largely caused by swelling and inflammation. As those improved, his vision gradually returned to normal. When the doctor delivered the news, Brian nearly cried, because throughout the entire ordeal, one fear had overshadowed every other fear. The fear of losing part of himself forever. The fear of waking up one morning and realizing that the damage could never be undone. For the first time since entering the emergency room, that fear began losing its grip. But recovery wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect. The infection could be stopped. The bacteria could be eliminated. The abscess could be drained. But tissue doesn't always bounce back instantly. Inflammation leaves its mark. Severe infections leave scars, and healing requires patience. Weeks passed, then months. The swelling slowly receded. The redness faded. The tenderness disappeared. Friends who hadn't seen Brian in a while noticed the difference immediately. "You look much better." It was meant as a compliment. But every time he heard it, he remembered how bad things had become. Because recovery has a strange characteristic. People only see the finish line. They rarely see the road that led there. Months later, Brian returned for follow-up appointments. The infection was gone. The fever was gone. The pain was gone. But something else had changed: his habits. The physician who originally asked about the pillowcase laughed when Brian mentioned it, because now Brian changed his bedding obsessively, sometimes more often than necessary. But the lesson had never really been about a pillowcase. Not entirely. The pillowcase was merely the beginning. The real lesson was about small problems. Small problems have a way of disguising themselves. Tiny bump, a little redness, a little swelling, a little discomfort. Each one feels insignificant. Each one feels easy to postpone, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. Until one day you wake up and discover that the problem you ignored has become impossible to ignore. This is why doctors often worry less about the dramatic symptoms people notice and more about the subtle symptoms people dismiss. Because serious problems rarely announce themselves dramatically in the beginning. They whisper. They start small, a bump, a cough, a strange pain, a tiny change. And human beings are remarkably good at convincing themselves that small problems will disappear on their own. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they aren't. Brian spent 79 days assuming tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow the swelling would go away. Tomorrow the redness would improve. Tomorrow the pain would stop. Tomorrow he'd make an appointment. Tomorrow he'd take it seriously. But tomorrow kept moving, and while tomorrow moved forward, the infection moved forward too. A year later, most people would never know what happened. The swelling was gone. His face looked normal. The scars were subtle. The infection had become a memory, a frightening one, but a memory. Sometimes he would scroll through old photos from those 79 days. The progression shocked him every time. Because when you're living through a change day by day, you rarely notice how dramatic it becomes. Only later, only when you compare the beginning to the end. Only when you finally see the full picture. And that's what frightened him most. Not how bad things became, but how long he allowed them to become bad. How many opportunities existed to stop the process. How many chances he ignored. How many warnings he dismissed. All because the problem seemed small at first. The infection is gone now. The hospital visits are over. The emergency has passed. But Brian still remembers the morning he looked into the mirror on day 79. The morning he barely recognized the face staring back at him. The morning he realized that some of the most dangerous problems in life don't arrive all at once. They arrive gradually, quietly, one day at a time, until suddenly they're impossible to ignore. This story was inspired by real medical concepts involving skin infections, abscesses, delayed treatment, and facial complications. The underlying lesson is real. When your body repeatedly tells you something is wrong, pay attention. Small symptoms have a way of becoming much larger problems when given enough time. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. You just spent the last 30 minutes watching Brian's story unfold. You watched the swelling spread. You watched the fear build. You watched doctors race against time to save his face and his vision. And if you stayed all the way to the end, it means this story meant something to you. So if you're still here and you're not subscribed, I have a genuine question. What are you waiting for? Every week, I spend countless hours researching, writing, editing, and building stories like this from the ground up. Not because I have to, because I love sharing them with people who are fascinated by the strange, terrifying, and sometimes unbelievable things that can happen to the human body. The reality is that most people who watch these videos never subscribe. They watch. They enjoy the story. Then they leave and never find the channel again. If that's you, that's okay. But before you go, take 1 second and hit subscribe. It costs nothing. It takes less time than blinking. And it helps this channel continue creating stories like the one you just watched. And if you've decided not to subscribe, tell me why in the comments. Seriously, I read them. I'm curious what kept you from joining us after making it all the way to the end. Either way, thank you for spending your time here, and I'll see you in the next case. This is Hidden Pathogens.